This is the Scaling Secrets podcast. Jacob Parks is here from profitableideas.com, and Jacob is the president of strategy, partner, and chair of the board of directors for Profitable Ideas Exchange, PIE. And Jacob leads the long-term strategic business plan, curating the vision for growth, expanding service offerings for clients and prospective expert service firms, and of course, sharing perspectives through published articles and podcasts like he's doing right now. So, Jacob, glad to be speaking with you.
Thank you so much, Robert. Really happy to be here.
Happy to have you. And so this is a podcast for entrepreneurs who want to get to 7 and 8 figures. So keeping that in mind, what are you all about? What's your uniqueness? What's your elevator pitch? What are we going to find out from you today?
So I've certainly looked at the podcast and I love this kind of thing. I like hanging out with entrepreneurs. And so I think our business is focused on professional services, which is probably slightly different than some of the folks who listen to this podcast. But I thought it would be interesting to start with just what I think is kind of a key distinction between sort of service sales, which is to say professional services, law firms, accounting firms, management consultancies, engineering shops, those kinds of businesses versus product sales. And so we're looking at computers right now. I assume Robert has a computer, but he may have some sort of fancy podcast studio. I'm not totally sure. But a computer can be sold on features and benefits very easily. You can make a spreadsheet and say, I want this screen size, I want this memory, I want this amount of graphics. And you can make a spreadsheet with the available products in that price and buy it. Services are decidedly different. So Robert, maybe I can ask you a question. If you were going to hire a lawyer, maybe you're into some sort of legal problem, how would you go about finding a great lawyer?
I would do a Google search first and probably look at like the top 4 or 5. I would maybe ask a few people in my circle if they knew anyone, if it was appropriate. And then maybe I'd look on social media a bit and just kind of try to combine those factors and then like make a few phone calls. And then whoever got back to me first out of that subset is probably who I would go with.
Yeah, makes sense. So you mentioned, I think one of the key pieces that we think of in professional services sales is referrals, like getting someone who you trust to vouch for that person. Of course, what you didn't say is, I'm probably going to go with the low cost provider, because when it comes to your freedom, it's probably worth spending a little bit of money on that particular attorney. And so in this world, they tend to be a little bit less price sensitive, but that ramps up the need for relationship development. You need to do a really good job developing relationships, building trust, and building credibility with the people you want to serve, because they have to come to trust you. And I think we think of the 2 most important elements as trust, which is to say, they might let me watch their kids. They think I'm a good person. I'm going to do right by them. And credibility being something slightly different, which is in the credibility sense, you have to believe that I can do what I say I'm going to do. There is this term that these folks at Northwestern invented called a credence good. Are you familiar with that, Robert? A credence good? No. I think it's pretty interesting. It's like a term that basically means when someone is in a business and they are both responsible for diagnosing and fixing the problem. And so an easy example is like a mechanic can say, you need a whole new engine for $5,000, or you need like a switch in your gasoline and you'll be fine. And trust and credibility matters in that exchange. And when it comes to expert services like law, like accounting, that trust and obviously the credibility to do the job well are incredibly important factors, and something that I encourage all businesses in this space to think about when they're trying to go to market.
That is definitely a lot to think about. As far as you said, with a product, there's a lot of like benefits and comparison and can it work or not. And then with more of these service kinds of journeys, there's more steps to it, right? There's, like you said, you take the car in and they diagnose it and they fix it. And there's all this kind of worry about what the cost will be and how long will it take and will I be taken care of long term? Whatever they provided, will it actually work and will it stay fixed and will my car not break down? And so it seems like it seems like way different, but I imagine it's like a harder problem to solve than a product solution. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And what you point out is accurate too, which is that it's a much longer sales cycle. Like our sales cycle tends to be 12 to 15 meetings before we land a new deal. Of course, people who are selling cell phones at Verizon, it's a one meeting sale, right? You know what you want, you go in there and you buy it. And so it just is a longer sales cycle. And people who are in this business, this type of business, should sort of, think about that.
And it's good to have these thoughts, and it's good to kind of have this kind of like deep introspection about, well, what am I doing, and use my imagination a little bit and think about the Gantt charts and the pie charts and about this criteria and these abstract concepts. That way we can kind of be good at what we do, and we can have this focus and grow things. Because if we're just kind of doing the day to day and we're not measuring and we don't know about some of these really important factors, then we're just sort of surviving, and we don't want that, right? This is the Scaling Secret podcast. We want to grow. We want to meet our targets, exceed our targets. And so thinking about all that, it's always fun in a podcast to jump into stories, right? Because you've helped a lot of these different companies. From your bio, I saw you work with McKinsey and many others. So what comes to mind as far as a fun story that can help us out a little bit today, but that also might entertain us a little bit as far as like your past failures and you overcoming them?
Oh, sure. So since this is a podcast on scaling to certain revenue metrics, I'll just tell a story about our firm. So I started at this firm. We actually spun out of Arthur Andersen in 2001, just prior to the Enron debacle. And so we are a group focused on helping professional service firms with business development. But when I started here, we had decidedly no revenue. We were 3 people working out of an industrial park. We had built our own walls in order to sort of get our business going. I was reflecting on this time today because I was asking myself, like, what are the things that got us from, literally no work at all, going to lunch at 1 o'clock and calling it a day, nobody having any money, nobody having any health insurance, all the things that you hear about entrepreneurial initiatives. And I thought, what got us away from that? What got us away from having no work and having no salaries? And it certainly wasn't my genius, but I think that we made a commitment early on to hire the very best people. And I think that's advice I would give to every single person, is hire the very best people that you can. It's not easy. Sometimes I think you have to extend equity to people like that when you're trying to get them early on. But also you have to find people who have that desire in their belly to be entrepreneurial, who live in a world of risk. I was lucky enough to go out and I went to a thing called a Founders Forum, which is basically all entrepreneurial founders in the prop tech space, in the real estate space. And oh my word, was there this commonality with these people who could basically be what my boss calls the liver of the organization. People who can process all of the bad stuff and come out with a vision and with a plan. And so hiring the very best people with that kind of sentiment, I think, is really important. One other thing that I think we did early in those days that I think was sort of foolish and stupid is we spent a lot of time sitting around dreaming up what we might do on behalf of clients. Building whiteboards, talking about the services that we could do. Oh, maybe we should do a sales training business, or maybe we should do a conference facilitation business. And there is like no utility in sitting around and brainstorming like that. The right thing to do is to call up and ask your customers and would-be customers what problem they want solved, and to get busy solving that problem. I can't tell you how valuable that sort of light bulb was for us. It seems so simple, but when we started just going out to the market and saying, what do you need? We found businesses in which we could participate. But when we were trying to create from scratch, we were basically useless.
Well, okay, so you're saying that it's so important to hire the right people who will get on your team and be this liver of the organization. And I also find that really helpful and useful, that idea of don't get carried away, don't get crazy brainstorming all these beautiful solutions and then go and find the people. You're saying instead, go out and find the people and see where they're stuck and see where they need help. And like you said, that's simple advice, but simple advice, it's easy enough to sometimes do it on accident and not even pick it up. So simple advice is helpful to continue doing what you're doing right. And also simple advice sometimes is easy to miss or forget. And so I love that. And I also imagine that by doing it that way, by finding the people and then helping them, it helps to get past kind of the step one process of things, right? It's easy enough to get on the whiteboard and draw the beautiful boxes, but then when it comes time to implement and deliver, that's where you get kind of stuck because you're not really sure about the details. But if you have that exact person in mind, that exact business that you want to help, and you know where they're stuck and what their problems are and how you can help them, then I imagine it kind of gets everyone more excited to get something that's working, to get things over to the finish line. And so you have your company here where you help out these professional service business. And you mentioned before, that's like sometimes lawyers and accountants and things like that. Do you have a favorite niche about all these? Is there like a certain type of service that like really gets you excited?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure there's a type of service that gets me excited. I find myself most comfortable in the accounting space, mostly because we spun out of Arthur Andersen, and I've been serving accounting firms for 21 years. I have my 21st anniversary coming up actually next week of being with this company. And so I think I'm most comfortable with accounting stuff, but I find all professional services to be pretty fascinating. Going back to what you were saying earlier about kind of like getting the right people, it's true when you think about who you want to go after and the services you want to provide. So we call this shrink the pond and narrow cast. We're up in Montana, and so we're fly fishing people. And so we use a lot of corny fishing metaphors. But so often in our business, in the world of professional services, when people spin out to start a consulting firm, a lot of times they're spinning out from someplace like Accenture or Deloitte. And those firms can literally do anything. They have every service offering imaginable. And so there is a tendency when people spin out and start their own businesses to kind of go broad. And I think it's decidedly the wrong approach. And so I think you should shrink the pond, which is to say, what are the industries, the executive functions, the size of the companies that we have a right to serve, and build your business kind of one block at a time from there. There's sort of a classic consulting story about one time a million years ago, this consulting shop took on a pro bono job with the San Francisco Symphony. One of the partners' spouses was on the board, and they wanted to help them sort of resurrect the symphony. That consulting firm ended up building a huge symphony practice after this pro bono project and winning all kinds of symphony projects around the country because they basically did what I'm saying. They narrowed their expertise and they delivered exceptional value in a narrow way, and they can kind of move out from there. We always tell this little joke where we say, Robert, do you know who the first person to fly across the Atlantic was?
No.
You should. It's he had a baby. He had a blimp that blew up.
Lindbergh?
Got it. Perfect. Thank you. So Lindbergh was the first.
I feel smart now.
No, you're super smart. And so then we always ask, who was the second person? Nobody ever knows, right? It's Bert Hinkler. He's in the dustbin of history. And then we say, who's the third person though? And everybody goes, I don't know the second person. How can I have the third person? We go, who's the first woman?
Amelia Earhart.
Amelia Earhart. Everybody knows. And that's just, to us, that's just proper narrowing the pond and, shrinking the pond and narrow casting, where if you can't be the very best, if you can't be McKinsey, if you can't be Accenture, narrow the pond and be the very best at something else, at something narrow, at a narrow geography, but be the best or be the first and start your business there and grow it from there. Don't try to be all things to all people, because it just doesn't resonate with the buyer.
And that makes sense when you put it that way, right? When you try to be all things to all people and you're not narrowed down, but if you carve out your own niche, then you have something specific to talk about. And then it also helps you along in the future, right? Because you have that first success, and that example of the San Francisco Symphony. Now they could go and replicate that with other symphonies and say, hey, we helped the San Francisco Symphony. They were in a similar situation as you, and here's a solution that we can provide. And they can say, hey, they're a lot like me, and I have similar problems as them. And also even refining the system, I imagine, of just like all the work that has to be done on the tasks and the delegating. Instead of having to reinvent the wheel with every job, you just kind of, since you're super hyper focused and narrow in this way with the small pond, you can just take that show on the road, so to speak. And so this is all wonderful to think about. And in these companies that you help, right, to grow these service businesses, hire the right people, avoid a lot of these mistakes, is there like a number one mistake that you see happening a lot, something that could really use improvement? Is it like follow-up or customer service, or just what are we all missing the mark on these days?
In services, we sort of touched on this a little bit, but people do not listen to their customers enough, to their clients enough. There's a joke we tell in professional services that senior partners only win work on their own brilliance and only lose work on price, because they do a lousy job of sort of customer feedback. Right now, one of the things that's sort of popular or a buzzword is this idea of customer journey. How do we map out a very good experience from our customers from our very first reach out until we're sort of getting additional work with them as we expand the mandate of our contract inside of that organization? But there's a million different reasons why it doesn't happen. Political, time, people don't want to hear the truth. But just listening to customers more is the biggest mistake that everybody makes. And in fact, I think one of the pieces of advice that we give to people is, to the extent that you want to own this particular industry, this particular area, you should underwrite the conversation. And I'll give you an example of how we do that. We're interested in working with professional services organizations, law firms, accounting firms. We've talked about this. And so on basically an every other month basis, I host a best practices sharing peer group call with chief marketing officers and a separate one with chief growth officers who are basically working on the challenges that we want to help people with. It does a couple of things. It allows us to get to know these people in a non-salesy way. It allows us to understand their challenges in sort of a deep and robust way. And it allows us to ask for the opportunity when the time is right, but not to be going through the trappings of cold calling, reaching out, and being a hammer looking for a nail. We want to be sort of a solution that just fits into the particular problem that they have.
And is there a way that we can tap into your kind of getting back to the basics, some of these things that you're talking about, right? Of like listening to your customers and just kind of the simplicity of it. It's sometimes difficult, right? It's like there's the temptation. I want to do like what's new and exciting and not been done yet. And then you always hear these kind of repeat lessons about like the best basketball coaches. They start off saying like, here's a basketball, here's the rules. And it's always kind of fun to think about just getting back to these fundamentals. So how do we tap into this? How do we get excited and energized about just going back to these basics and making things simple?
So, I mean, if I think I understand your question correctly, I do think one is like proper alignment to the strategic vision of the organization. I think we see this particularly in times in marketing. There's so much cool stuff you can do in marketing, and particularly with artificial intelligence, unlocking this potential to do creative so quickly. But we have to tie everything into what we're trying to do as a business and having good strategic oversight and a good plan for what we want to accomplish. We want to grow 20% this year. Let's start, I think it's Stephen Covey, right? Begin with the end in mind. So if we want to grow 20% this year, what are the activities we have to do in order to do that? And what are the things that we're doing right now that are sort of pointless? A big sort of trend over the last 5 years in big companies has been this idea of zero-based budgeting. Have you ever heard of this?
I've heard of it, don't understand it.
So basically, zero-based budgeting means that rather than carrying budgets forward every single year, like we've traditionally done in corporate America, every single budget holder starts at zero. And we remake the case for all the stuff we want to spend on. And it sort of tends to pull out kind of line items that just exist that maybe aren't producing that much value. And I always encourage people who are in these size of businesses to kind of zero-based budget their strategic plan. Do we need this year? Why are we doing this? And what's the outcome we expect from this? And darn it, let's measure that outcome. And if it doesn't work, let's do something different next year. But all of this sort of political angling and different things that can exist inside of a corporation, sometimes you end up putting time, talent, and treasure at things that probably aren't worth the effort.
That makes a lot of sense, to re-examine everything and question these items that maybe you've been stuck in this old-fashioned thinking, or thinking that this line item on the budget always needs to be there. And what's the harm in just revisiting that and making sure that it's actually essential and that it's actually serving you? And so we've been having a lot of just all kinds of conversations over here and over there, and it's been a lot of fun and action-packed. But is there a question that comes to mind that I'm maybe not asking you? I want to make sure that we use this platform to get your ideas out, and then people can fall in love with the things that you have to say. So is there like a missing question in our conversation that you wish I'd asked of you?
No, but I think one thing I would just say, because I mean, I've been thinking about, I started at this business in 2003. We had, no employees, and we had $40,000 of revenue effectively, right? So I have been here and now we're a little north of 14 million in terms of revenue. So I've seen the scaling from exactly what you're talking about. And I would just offer this advice to people who are going through the same process. There are inflection points in these companies when the company breaks. Like 0 to 10 people, everybody knows what's happening in every single thing in the business. When you get to 30 people, the business kind of breaks, and you have to have new process, new systems to get stuff done. I think the same thing is true around 100 people. The company breaks again at 100 people, and you have to reinvent the process, and you have to reinvent the structure and all that kind of stuff. And I think as entrepreneurs, we are generally guilty of going, yeah, we'll figure it out as we go. And what I would say is to everybody to pick up a copy of this book that I love called The Checklist Manifesto. And it sort of makes the case that we should be using checklists for everything. And the same is true in your businesses. Documenting process, solidifying process, even if it's sort of antithetical to the entrepreneurial spirit, which I think sometimes it feels that way to us. And thinking about the business, not in terms of what do we need next week, but what should the business look like when we get to 100 people, to 500 people, whatever the different revenue benchmarks are for people, but try to be looking around the corner, because those things can get you into some prickly situations with clients and with internal employees if you're not looking out to that next level.
I love it. So we need to adopt the checklist manifesto and what it teaches, so that way we can have some of this predictability, even though, as you said, it goes against some of the cowboy tendencies and kind of the behavior that you want to have as an entrepreneur growing your organization. But you need this other tool in the toolbox, that way you have some of that predictability and things are more reliable as your company breaks and you have to kind of reinvent these sorts of things. And so speaking of the future and growth and success, what lies ahead for you and your company? What do you have that excites you about the near future?
Yeah, so I think I'm incredibly excited about the future of our business. I'm hopeful that the economic environment is turning a little bit. I think that the last year or so has been probably the most unusual environment I've ever operated in, with almost zero unemployment, inflation ticking down, but still a very scary economic situation. So I think prosperity is coming. And so I'm excited about the future of our business, continuing to serve a variety of professional services firms. And then I have made the mistake that I said I would never do again, and I've signed up to write another book. And so a couple of partners and I are going to write a book about what does a great sales organization look like in professional services. And it's an interesting topic because the last book we did was called Never Say Sell, because these people do not like to talk about selling. It's a turnoff in these firms, and it's more about growth and business development and everything else. But we're going to kind of take a top-down view of what does an absolutely world-class organization look like when it comes to business development. And I'm excited about that and nervous that my weekends are going to be spent at the Davenport Hotel in Spokane, Washington, writing. But that'll be fun.
And I have been there. They have some really amazing beds.
It's a great hotel.
Oh, yeah, it's wonderful. It's beautiful. And so you have some exciting times ahead in multiple ways, right? Just in the uncertainty of it and committing to this book and just trying to find the time, but also in the excitement of creating a book and kind of going through, as you made a book before, that there's like kind of the metamorphosis that you yourself go through as you really get a handle on your ideas. And then when people pick up and read and digest your book, sometimes you can change minds because you can show them this better way and have all this kind of more time to break them down, so to speak, and show them these new perspectives. And so if someone says, man, this Jacob Parks guy, he really has a lot figured out, and I want to jump in and see if he can help me in my company, how does someone know if they're a right fit for you, and where do they go?
Yeah, so they can go to our website or they can just email me directly. I can include my contact information. But I think in general, anyone who is looking to sort of engage customers, particularly in sort of a roundtable format, have help with business development strategy, build a client advisory board, all of those kinds of things are the things we're most helpful with, and in particular for professional services firms. So if you're a law firm, an accounting firm, and you're looking for help in this space, we'd be delighted to meet you and just hear a little bit about what you're working through.
Wonderful. And so we'll have the link to go and take the next step with you in the show notes. Is it possible to drop a URL just in case they can't find the link?
Absolutely, no problem. You want me to do that now?
Yeah. Do you have something just we can speak out loud?
Sure. Absolutely. It's profitableideas.com.
profitableideas.com, Jacob Parks. So if your business needs help getting those things that you mentioned from the customer conversation and business development strategy, all those things, then contact Jacob Parks. And as we're winding down our conversation here, Jacob, it's always fun to end with a bang and not a whimper. So I like to put my guests on the spot and ask them about a quote or lesson that can really just help get us on our way and also wrap up the whole conversation. So what just jumps out of your mind, doesn't even have to be that relevant, but what comes to mind as far as a quote or lesson?
Yeah, so I think the quote I would have is begin with the end in mind. I said it earlier, but too frequently we get bogged down in activities and not enough in outcomes. And so as entrepreneurs, again, with the breaking, I'll give you a Gerber quote. I think it's Michael Gerber who had this quote. But we should work on our businesses, not in our businesses. And I think that, again, at that kind of 30-person mark, that's when you start to separate and get into working on your business. And so I would encourage everybody to take a step back, think about your business holistically, and kind of work on the business. Don't let the urgent outweigh the important, and sort of build that long-term strategy instead of just putting out fires.
I love it. And we love the Eisenhower Square and we love the E-Myth, and they're all just really basic fundamental concepts, but worth revisiting. And a lot of people don't implement. So we need to just be keeping these fundamentals in mind as we get that business to the next level. So Jacob Parks, wonderful speaking with you.
Great to meet you, Robert. Thank you so much for having me on.
All right.